I don't usually shop for groceries after midnight, but that night the quiet felt almost inviting. The air outside was cool and dry, carrying the faint smell of asphalt cooling from a warm day. The street leading to the 24-hour grocery store stretched like a dark corridor between rows of sleeping houses. Every window I passed was blackened, curtains drawn, the world behind them locked away. My footsteps echoed in the stillness, each one sharp enough to feel intrusive. It was the kind of night where the silence didn't just exist. It pressed against you, filling every space where sound should be. Inside the grocery store, the artificial brightness was almost painful. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed like a swarm of insects trapped in glass. I wandered the empty aisles, the wheels of the basket squealing against polished linoleum. The smell of cold produce and industrial cleaner mixed into something faintly metallic, something sterile and dry. My body felt small beneath the relentless white light. Every creak of the refrigeration units sounded amplified, like distant breathing hiding inside the walls. There was no one at the checkout except a tired cashier leaning against the counter, head down. Her presence was almost a relief, a reminder that the world wasn't entirely asleep. Still, I barely looked at her as I paid. My mind was already reaching for the quiet of home. I stepped back into the night with a small paper bag in hand, expecting the cool air to feel cleansing. Instead, the darkness seemed thicker than before, heavy with a faint dampness that smelled of distant rain. The parking lot was empty, except for a single flickering street lamp. Its light fell in weak yellow pools across the cracked asphalt. My car sat alone near the edge, a dark shape under a skeletal tree. As I walked toward it, I became aware of something subtle, another set of sounds blending with mine. Faint, irregular footsteps. At first I thought it was the echo of my own shoes bouncing strangely across the open lot. But when I stopped, the sound continued for half a beat before ceasing. A lag. Not an echo. Someone else was moving. I turned, scanning the lot. Nothing but shadows stretching from the lamp posts. The flickering light caught on the silver edges of shopping carts corralled near the entrance. The store doors were closed now, the cashier hidden behind layers of glass and fluorescence. I waited, listening. Only the hum of the lamp, a faint electric whine. My heart beat against my ribs, a dull pressure. I unlocked the car and slid inside, locking the doors with a quick snap. The interior smelled faintly of old coffee and worn upholstery. I set the bag on the passenger seat and gripped the steering wheel, waiting for a reason to start the engine. Through the windshield, the parking lot looked like a stage after a performance. Empty, too still, waiting for something unseen to cross it. The drive home was short, barely 5 minutes, but every intersection felt longer than it should. Streetlights glowed pale and lonely, throwing thin shadows across the wet asphalt. My headlights caught the occasional glint of glass or damp leaves. Twice I thought I saw movement in my mirrors, shapes slipping out of sight just as I turned my head. Each time my stomach tightened, a cold knot spreading under my ribs. My apartment building was a low, aging structure with walls that smelled faintly of rust and damp concrete. The hallway greeted me with its familiar chill, the air heavy with the scent of old paint and faint mildew. My shoes squeaked softly on the waxed floor. I climbed the stairs, each step hollow and deliberate, the grocery bag rustling against my leg. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, measured, matching the rhythm of mine, but always a fraction behind. They seemed to emerge from the stairwell below, rising up toward me with patient intent. I paused, one hand on the railing, holding my breath. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was dense and electric, like the moment before a storm breaks. I forced myself to continue, each step deliberate, my heartbeat pounding loud enough to mask everything else. At my floor, I glanced down the stairwell. The concrete steps spiraled into darkness, the weak overhead bulb barely illuminating the first few flights. Nothing moved, yet the hair along my arms stood rigid, reacting to something I couldn't name. Inside my apartment, the air smelled of stale detergent and the faint sweetness of the fruit I had bought. I closed the door carefully, turning the deadbolt with a soft click. For a moment I just stood there listening. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Pipes groaned faintly behind the walls. Normal sounds, but each one carried a sharp edge that made me flinch. I unpacked the groceries with deliberate slowness, the rustle of paper loud in the quiet. Somewhere in the hallway outside, a faint scuff echoed, a single foot dragging across tile. I froze, my fingers gripping the carton of milk until the cardboard softened beneath the pressure. Another sound followed, soft, deliberate steps. They stopped outside my door. I moved closer, pressing my ear against the wood. Nothing. Not a breath, not a shift of weight. Only the thick silence of someone waiting. The door vibrated faintly, a tremor I could feel through the frame. It could have been the pipes, the building settling, but it felt too precise, like fingertips brushing lightly against the surface. Minutes passed. My heartbeat slowed, but never fully calmed. I slid the chain lock across and stepped back, my eyes fixed on the thin shadow under the door. For an instant, a darker shape passed across the narrow strip of light from the hallway. A shadow where no shadow should be. Then it was gone. I stayed awake for hours, lights on, listening to every creak of the building. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps descending the stairs, fading into the lower levels. Other times, faint scratching, as if something dragged lightly along the hallway wall. Each sound made the air feel heavier, the smell of the room sharper, almost metallic. Eventually the night began to pale, the first hint of dawn seeping through the blinds. The sound stopped as suddenly as they had begun, leaving a silence that felt almost mocking. I never opened the door to check. I couldn't bring myself to face the hallway. Even now, days later, I can't shake the feeling that those unseen steps are still nearby. Sometimes late at night, I think I hear them again, soft, deliberate, patient. Always following, always waiting, just beyond the thin barrier of wood and lock. And each time, I remember the flickering lamp in the grocery parking lot, and the echo that wasn't an echo, the half-beat of footsteps that never belonged to me. I don't usually stay late at work. There's a certain comfort in leaving before the building grows silent, before the fluorescent lights hum like tired bees, and the hallways take on that hollow stillness that makes you feel like an intruder in a place you belong to all day. But that night, a project deadline pinned me to my desk far longer than I'd planned. By the time I finally packed up, the office was empty. The elevators carried only me, their mechanical groans echoing in the shaft as though reluctant to take me down to the bottom level where my car waited. The parking garage beneath the building always unsettled me, even in daylight. It wasn't just the smell of oil-soaked concrete or the damp chill that clung to the air. It was the way sound traveled there. Every footstep, every door slam, every drop of water stretching into the distance like a whisper you weren't supposed to hear. At night, that effect multiplied. I stepped out of the elevator into a silence so thick it felt like stepping underwater. The faint buzz of a dying fluorescent bulb overhead flickered a sickly green glow across the gray walls. It was cold enough that my breath came out in thin, pale ribbons, each exhale floating before me before dissolving into the stale air. My shoes clicked against the concrete floor, each step sending a hollow echo bouncing through the cavernous space. The sound didn't fade the way it should have. Instead, it lingered, stretching along the length of the garage, curling back toward me like something alive. I tried to ignore it and walked toward my car. Rows of empty parking spaces flanked me on both sides, long, yawning corridors of shadow interrupted only by the occasional concrete pillar. My car sat near the far corner, a lonely silhouette beneath a flickering light. The garage felt bigger than usual, as though the absence of cars had somehow expanded the dimensions of the space. Halfway across the garage, I heard the first sound that didn't belong to me. It was faint at first, soft, deliberate steps somewhere behind me. I froze mid-stride, my own echo dying slowly until it left nothing but silence. For a moment, I told myself it was nothing, a building settling, a pipe releasing pressure. But then it came again, a single footstep, then another. Slow, heavy, perfectly spaced. Not the random creak of a structure, but the measured rhythm of someone walking. I turned sharply, scanning the expanse behind me. The concrete stretched back toward the elevator lobby, lit by scattered islands of light. Empty, completely empty. The air smelled of damp stone and faint gasoline, and the silence pressed against my ears until I could hear the blood moving through my own head. My heart began to thud, matching the rhythm I'd just heard. I stood still long enough that the cold started to seep into my bones, and then I forced myself to move again, each step quickening despite the weight in my chest. The footsteps returned. They didn't mimic mine this time. They followed, slow and steady, each one slightly delayed, as if whoever, or whatever, was behind me wanted me to know they were there, but not to catch a glimpse. The echoes tangled with my own, making it impossible to tell how far away they were. I turned again, snapping my head toward the sound, but the garage stretched into emptiness. Only the buzzing fluorescent lights and the damp smell of concrete waited for me. I started walking faster, my keys digging into my palm. The sound behind me quickened too, keeping perfect pace. The echo made it feel as though the entire garage pulsed with footsteps, mine, theirs, overlapping until it was impossible to separate them. My shoes scraped against the rough concrete, the sound painfully loud in the oppressive quiet. I could hear small details now. The faint drip of water from a leaking pipe, the metallic groan of the ventilation ducts, the soft rustle of air moving where it shouldn't. When I finally reached my car, I nearly dropped the keys trying to unlock the door. My hands trembled so violently that the small metal teeth rattled against each other like chattering bones. I fumbled, cursed under my breath, and finally managed to unlock it. I yanked the door open and slid inside, slamming it shut with a force that echoed through the garage. The slam was loud enough that it masked the footsteps for a fraction of a second, and in that sliver of silence, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined everything. Then the sound came again. Closer. I locked the doors and pressed my back against the seat, my breath fogging the cold interior. Through the windshield, the garage stretched into an ocean of shadow and pale light. I scanned every direction, expecting to see a figure emerge from behind one of the pillars. Nothing moved. The silence after each echo was almost worse than the sound itself. I could hear the faint ringing of the fluorescent lights overhead, the low mechanical heartbeat of the building. But no one. No thing. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine coughed to life with a metallic growl that shattered the quiet. The sound felt obscene in the stillness, like shouting in a church. My headlights cut through the dark, revealing nothing but rows of empty spaces and damp concrete. I shifted into reverse, the tires squealing slightly against the cold floor. That's when I heard it. Not behind me this time. Above. Footsteps. Directly over the car. Slow, deliberate, impossibly heavy. The ceiling of the garage was bare concrete, no second level above me, just pipes and steel beams. Yet the sound came from directly overhead, each step sending a faint vibration through the roof of my car. A slow scrape, a measured thud, moving from the back of the car toward the front, as if something walked along the very air itself. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. My chest burned with the effort of holding my breath. The sound stopped just above the driver's side door. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of nails, or claws, trailing across the roof. A slow, deliberate drag of something sharp against metal. The noise set my teeth on edge, a thin metallic shriek that cut through the air like a blade. I didn't look up. I couldn't. I slammed the car into drive and pressed the accelerator to the floor. The tires screeched, echoing off the walls as I sped toward the exit. The sound followed me, footsteps pounding overhead, matching the speed of the car, keeping pace as though running on an invisible track just above the ceiling. The garage became a blur of pillars and flickering lights as I raced forward. My breath came in sharp, ragged bursts. My chest felt like it might cave in. As I neared the ramp that led to the street, the sound suddenly stopped. The silence was so abrupt it felt like the air had been sucked out of the space. I didn't slow down. I didn't dare look back. I burst out into the night, the cold air of the city slamming against the windshield like a wave. Only when I reached the next intersection did I allow myself to breathe. Even then, the memory of those footsteps clung to me like a second skin. I could still feel the vibration through the roof, still hear the scrape of nails dragging across metal. The smell of damp concrete and stale gasoline seemed to follow me into the night, an invisible reminder of what I'd left behind. I haven't parked in that garage since. I take the street now, no matter the hour, no matter the cost. Yet sometimes, late at night when I walk to my car, I swear I hear it again, a faint echo carried on the wind. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate, as if something has learned how to follow me even after I left the garage behind. The air smelled of damp pine and old earth when I started the hike that evening, a scent thick enough to cling to the back of my throat. The trail stretched ahead in a wavering ribbon of pale dirt, narrowing as it threaded deeper into the hills. Twilight hovered just beyond the tree line, a muted blue bleeding into the dimming sky, and I remember thinking how strangely heavy the silence felt. Even the usual chorus of birds seemed to have dissolved into nothing. My boots pressed into the soil with a muffled crunch, each step sinking slightly into the damp ground left behind by a late afternoon drizzle. The trail was slick in places, scattered with wet leaves that shone faintly like polished leather. I could hear the faint creak of the small daypack on my shoulders, the strap rubbing against the rough fabric of my jacket with each stride. That subtle, human sound was reassuring at first, proof that I was the only moving thing in this dim corridor of trees. The deeper I went, the more the light broke apart into shadow. Tall firs leaned over the path like an archway, their branches forming a jagged ceiling that trapped the last breath of daylight. The smell of wet bark and moss sharpened, cold and mineral. My breath puffed in small, cloudy bursts, and I found myself adjusting my pace to match the rhythm of those faint exhalations. Step, exhale, step, exhale. Somewhere behind me, the faintest echo of a footstep followed. It was so soft that at first I thought it might be the sound of a branch releasing a bead of rain, or the muffled slide of a stone dislodged by my own movement. But the sound had a weight to it, a dull compression of soil that didn't quite match the light patter of water or falling leaves. My ears pricked instinctively, and I slowed until my own boots barely disturbed the earth. Silence pressed in. Only the soft hiss of wind sliding through needles remained. I waited, head tilted slightly, heart beginning to thump a little harder against my ribs. The smell of the forest seemed stronger in the pause, as though the damp earth itself was breathing. Nothing moved. When I finally stepped forward again, the sound returned. A single, deliberate crunch, slightly behind and to the left. It was not an animal. I know the uneven skitter of a deer, the quick scrabble of a raccoon or fox. This was measured, human. My shoulders tightened under the straps of the pack. I forced myself not to turn around too quickly, letting my eyes slide casually to the edges of the trail. Only the dim green-black of trees greeted me, their trunks slick and shining where the rain had darkened the bark. No movement, no color but shadow, and the fading gray of the dirt path. I kept walking. My steps were steady, but I could feel the subtle change in my body, the way my breathing had shortened without my permission, the way each muscle waited for the next sound. The trail twisted between the trunks like a long spine, curling into darker territory. The sky was almost gone now, a strip of deep cobalt barely visible through the net of branches overhead. The next footstep was closer, not loud, not fast, just there, a pressure against the silence, unmistakable. The damp air tasted metallic as I swallowed hard. I told myself it could be another hiker. People came to these hills at odd hours, chasing solitude, testing their endurance. But there was something about the timing, each soft impact falling just after mine, like an echo that wasn't quite in sync. Too precise to be coincidence. The trail narrowed until the trees crowded so close that their trunks brushed the edges of my sleeves. Their bark was slick and ridged, grooves filled with cold water that gleamed faintly when my flashlight beam slid across them. I hadn't meant to take the flashlight out, but at some point my fingers had unzipped the side pocket of the pack and wrapped around the smooth plastic cylinder. The beam wavered across the path, slicing through mist that had begun to rise from the damp earth. Each particle glittered briefly before disappearing into darkness. I swept the light behind me. The beam dissolved into a wall of trees and fog, revealing nothing but the sharp gleam of wet leaves. No movement, no figure, only the heavy hush of the forest swallowing the light. When I turned back, another sound slid through the air. Not a step this time, more like the faint scuff of a soul adjusting its weight on damp soil. A pause, a patient shift. The urge to run pulsed through my muscles, but something colder held me back. Running would make noise. Noise would invite something I couldn't name. Instead, I quickened my pace just enough to feel the pack bounce slightly against my back, each movement a quiet plea to the trail to open faster, to lead me to an end that felt miles away. The forest responded by tightening. The air thickened with a damp chill that clung to my skin. Every tree looked the same now, dark, slick, and different. My flashlight beam trembled with each heartbeat. I could hear my own breathing loud in the small chamber of my hood, but beneath it came another sound. Shoes, soft but certain, keeping pace. Sometimes they fell exactly after mine, a faint twin shadow of sound. Other times they drifted, a half beat late or early, as if whoever, or whatever, was behind me wanted to remind me that they were not simply following, but playing. The trail dipped suddenly, spilling me into a hollow where the mist pooled like breath caught in a cupped hand. My boots slid on the wet soil, sending a small shower of stones skittering forward. I froze at the sound. The forest froze with me. And then, impossibly close, a footstep landed on the stones I had just disturbed. My throat tightened until breathing became a shallow, frantic thing. The smell of wet leaves filled my nose like a heavy blanket. I raised the flashlight and spun the beam across the hollow. Trees stood silent, their trunks slick and gleaming. Branches shifted faintly in the rising fog. The beam cut across nothing but empty air. But I felt it, a presence just outside the reach of the light. Not seen, not heard now, only felt. The hike back was a blur of damp earth and trembling muscles. I don't remember making the decision to turn around. One moment I was staring into the fog, the next I was moving, boots striking the path in a near run that I tried to disguise as a brisk walk. The footsteps followed, always just far enough behind to stay hidden, but close enough to let the sound bleed through. Crunch, pause, crunch. Each one landed like a heartbeat against my spine. The trail seemed longer on the return, stretching in ways that defied memory. Landmarks I thought I knew appeared twisted, the shapes of fallen logs and leaning trunks different in the beam of the flashlight. My sense of distance warped until I wasn't sure if I was moving toward the trailhead or deeper into the woods. The smell of the earth grew sharper, almost sour, as if the forest itself had begun to rot around me. Mist thickened until the beam of the flashlight could barely pierce more than a few feet ahead. I felt the dampness settle into my clothes, a cold that sank into bone. And still the sound followed. Sometimes it quickened when I quickened. Sometimes it lagged as if waiting, never stopping. At one point, the trail curved sharply around a dense cluster of firs. As I rounded the bend, the sound behind me ceased entirely. My heart hammered against the silence, each beat a thunderous echo in my chest. I risked a glance back, flashlight trembling in my grip. For a single, impossible instant, I thought I saw something at the very edge of the beam. A darker shape among dark trunks. Not moving, not breathing, only standing. The mist closed around it before I could focus, swallowing the shape into a gray nothing. I ran after that. Not a measured hike, not a cautious retreat. A full, desperate sprint, my boots skidding on wet earth, branches clawing at my jacket. The forest blurred into streaks of black and silver as the trail finally began to widen, the smell of pine and cold air sharpening into something almost metallic with speed. The footsteps followed for a time, then they didn't. When I finally stumbled out of the tree line and into the gravel parking area, night had fully claimed the sky. My car sat alone under the dim glow of a failing street lamp, its silver surface slick with mist. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so hard the metal jingled like brittle bones. Only when the car door slammed shut behind me did I realize how quiet the world had become. The forest loomed like a black wall at the edge of the lot. No footsteps, no echo, but as I started the engine, a faint sound drifted through the open crack of my window. A single, deliberate crunch of shoes on gravel. Close. Too close. I drove without looking back. I never liked the silence of my apartment at night. It was the kind of silence that wasn't truly silent, thick enough to press against your ears, heavy enough that every small sound inside the building became painfully distinct. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the low hiss of water inside the pipes, even the soft tick of the clock above the stove sounded amplified when I was alone. On that particular evening, the air felt heavier than usual, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The apartment wasn't old, but it carried a character that made it seem older than it really was. The floors were original hardwood, dark and uneven, with a shine that dulled near the corners. During the day, they creaked in harmless protest under my steps, a soft complaint that came from decades of use. At night, however, those creaks changed. They sharpened. They seemed to echo longer than they should, as if the sound itself lingered in the air, unsure of where to settle. It was late, just past midnight, when I realized how aware I had become of the floor beneath me. I was sitting on my couch, half watching a muted television screen while the glow of city lights filtered through the blinds. My building faced a quiet street, and the occasional flash of headlights painted the walls in slow, moving streaks of pale white. Outside, a cold wind rattled the loose metal of the fire escape. Inside, the air smelled faintly of varnish and dust, a scent that clung to the wood no matter how often I cleaned. That was when I heard the first sound. A single creak, deep and deliberate, from somewhere in the hallway outside my bedroom. It wasn't the quick pop of wood adjusting to temperature, nor the random settling noises that I had grown used to. This was different, longer, drawn out, almost like the groan of a weight shifting against the grain. I froze without meaning to. My eyes flicked toward the dark hallway, but there was nothing to see. The lights in the living room cast a soft yellow glow, but the hallway beyond was a void of shadow. The door to my bedroom stood half open, its brass knob reflecting a faint glint from the television. The sound didn't repeat. For a while, I told myself it had been nothing more than the building settling against the cold night air. Several minutes passed. My heartbeat slowed. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. And then it came again. Another creak, this time sharper, closer, as if something heavy had shifted its weight on the floorboards just inside my bedroom doorway. A shiver ran up the back of my neck. The air in the apartment felt suddenly different, as though the temperature had dropped a few degrees. My skin prickled with a cold that wasn't entirely physical. I leaned forward slightly, straining to hear beyond the steady hum of the refrigerator. Nothing, just silence. But it was a silence charged with tension, the kind that makes every instinct in your body lean toward alertness. I thought about standing, about walking toward the hallway to check, but something inside me resisted. The idea of putting my feet on those creaking floors felt unbearable, as if the sound would somehow announce me to whatever might be standing unseen in the dark. I stayed where I was, sinking deeper into the couch, my eyes fixed on the hallway's shadowed opening. Then came the third sound. It wasn't a single creak this time, but a slow, deliberate sequence. 1, 2, 3. Each step was spaced apart with careful precision, the wood complaining softly beneath invisible weight. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was moving across the floor of my apartment. The realization settled over me like a sheet of ice. I was alone. I had locked the door hours ago. There should have been no one else inside. The idea of an intruder flickered across my mind, but even that explanation didn't fit the sound I was hearing. These steps were too slow, too patient, as though whoever made them wasn't searching for anything. It was the sound of someone simply existing in the space, aware that I was listening. I tried to steady my breathing. Each inhale felt too loud, each exhale a risk. The scent of dust and wood polish seemed sharper now, tinged with the faint metallic bite of fear. My eyes darted to the apartment door, still deadbolt and untouched. No movement, no sound from the street outside. Just the quiet, punctuated by those occasional, drawn-out creaks. The steps continued, wandering with an almost casual rhythm. They moved from the bedroom to the narrow hallway, then paused near the bathroom door. The floor there had a distinct tone when stepped on, a low, hollow groan. And that was exactly what I heard next. It was as if the unseen presence knew every weak spot in the wood, pressing its weight into each one to announce itself. I told myself to move, to grab my phone, to do anything but sit and listen. Yet my body refused to obey. I remained rooted to the couch, every muscle locked in tense anticipation. My ears strained to track the movement. The sound drifted toward the kitchen, where the refrigerator's low hum provided a faint cover. For a few moments, the creaks blended with the mechanical noise until I almost convinced myself it was over. Then, without warning, the sound returned, this time directly behind the couch. The floor beneath my own feet vibrated faintly, a subtle tremor that carried through the wood and into my bones. I didn't dare turn around. The air smelled different now, faintly musty, like damp fabric left too long in the dark. It felt as if the space behind me was occupied by something I couldn't see, but could almost sense. Something standing still, watching. The television screen flickered with a sudden burst of static before returning to its dim glow. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it against the inside of my chest. I stared at the reflection in the black glass, hoping to catch even a distorted glimpse of what might be behind me. But there was nothing, only the faint outline of my own tense posture. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. The floor remained silent. Slowly, I turned my head, inch by inch, until I could see the space behind the couch. Empty. Nothing but the same wooden floor, the same dim light. Yet the air still felt occupied, as if the emptiness itself was aware of being watched. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling with the effort. Each step toward the hallway felt like moving through water, heavy and sluggish. The floor groaned softly under my weight, each creak a nervous echo of the sounds that had drawn me here. I reached the doorway to my bedroom and hesitated. The darkness inside was complete, swallowing even the faint light from the living room. The smell of old wood was stronger here, mixed with something faintly metallic, like rust or blood. I stepped inside. The boards beneath my feet shifted with a long, aching moan. My eyes adjusted slowly to the dark shapes of furniture. Nothing moved. The closet door stood slightly ajar, but not enough to suggest disturbance. The window was shut and locked, the curtains swaying gently as though touched by a breeze that shouldn't exist. And then, from the far corner of the room, the floor creaked again. A single, low groan, drawn out and deliberate. It didn't come from beneath my feet. It came from the shadowed corner where no one stood. The sound vibrated through the floor, through my legs, up into my chest, until it felt as though the apartment itself was breathing. I backed away slowly, step by step, until I reached the living room once more. My heart hammered with a frantic rhythm. Every instinct screamed to leave, to run into the cold night and never return. Instead, I locked myself in the bathroom, sitting against the door with my phone clutched tightly in my hand. I listened for hours. Sometimes there was silence so pure it rang in my ears. Other times, faint creaks drifted through the floor as if someone or something was pacing just outside, never rushing, never stopping completely. When dawn finally came, the light through the blinds felt unreal. I opened the door cautiously. The apartment looked unchanged. No signs of entry, no footprints, just the familiar smell of varnish and dust, and the floorboards, silent now but waiting. I have lived here ever since. The locks remain secure, the windows sealed. Yet every night, as the city quiets and the darkness thickens, I feel the weight of the floor beneath me. I hear the faint memory of those creaks in the back of my mind. And I know that when the air grows heavy and the silence presses close, the floors will speak again. The night smelled like rain long before the first drop touched the surface of the river. It was one of those damp evenings where the air itself feels swollen, heavy enough to press against the skin. I had been walking for nearly an hour, the kind of aimless wandering I sometimes did when I couldn't sleep, when the narrow road led me to a bridge I had never crossed before. The bridge looked older than the rest of the town. Its metal rails were dull with rust, streaked like dried blood under the flicker of two failing streetlights. The paint on the wooden planks had peeled away long ago, leaving only gray boards swollen from years of soaking rain. The water below was invisible, only a slow, cold smell rising up from it, a mineral stench that clung to the back of my throat. The sky hung low, the clouds thick and colorless, smothering the moon so completely that the world seemed carved from shadows. I stepped onto the first plank and felt it give slightly beneath my weight. The wood groaned with a damp, muffled sound, the kind of sound that travels strangely in an empty place. Every step I took carried out into the night, a hollow echo bouncing back from the iron skeleton of the bridge. It was too quiet beyond those echoes. No crickets, no distant hum of traffic, not even the gentle rush of the river. Just the slow, uneasy creak of wood beneath my shoes. Halfway across, I stopped. The bridge stretched in both directions like a gray ribbon fading into darkness. The air smelled stronger here, wet iron, old wood, something faintly metallic, like pennies left in the rain. I wrapped my jacket tighter around myself and kept walking, the sound of my own steps sharp and deliberate. One step, two, three. Then I heard them. Boots. Heavy. Slow. Behind me. At first I thought it was an echo, a strange rebound of my own movement. But the rhythm was wrong. Each time my foot met the wood, there was a slight pause before the second sound followed. It wasn't the quick clap of sound bouncing back. It was deliberate, weighted, and far heavier than my own. I froze. The bridge exhaled with a long, low creak as my body stilled. The boots stopped too. The silence after was unbearable. I could feel it pressing in from all sides, like the dark itself was leaning closer to listen. The smell of wet metal thickened until I could almost taste it. I turned my head slightly, but the streetlights behind me were too far, their weak glow drowned in fog. There was nothing to see but the soft, shifting black. I forced myself forward. The boards moaned under my next step, and again, after the smallest delay, the boots followed. Heavy, measured, not running, not even hurrying, just following. The sound vibrated through the bridge as though whoever, or whatever, was behind me carried a weight far greater than a man. The boards shuddered with each thud. I imagined thick saws pressing splinters deeper into the old wood, water seeping up through the cracks to darken the planks. I imagined something breathing in the fog, a shape that belonged to the noise but not to any human outline. I kept my eyes forward. Looking back felt impossible, like turning would break some fragile thread holding the night in place. My steps grew faster. The boots did not. They remained slow, deliberate, but somehow always matched the distance between us. No matter how quickly I moved, the sound never grew closer, never faded. The bridge seemed to lengthen with every stride. What should have been a 2-minute crossing stretched into an endless hallway of damp boards and cold air. The street light at the far end flickered weakly, a trembling glow in the dark. It looked both impossibly far and strangely near, like a reflection in water that moves as you move. The smell changed as I neared the center. The iron tang grew sharper, mixed with something sour and earthy, like old leather soaked in stagnant water. The wood beneath me felt softer, spongier, as if the river were slowly rising through it. Each step sank slightly, releasing a faint hiss of trapped moisture. The boots behind me sank deeper, their weight making the planks groan in protest. I wanted to run. Every nerve screamed to sprint the remaining distance, but the thought of running made something deep in me recoil. It felt like an invitation, as if fleeing would break whatever unspoken rule held the thing behind me to its slow pace. So I walked, fast but never running. My breaths came shallow and hot in the cold air, each exhale clouding the fog in front of me. The boots never faltered. When I finally reached the far end, the street light above buzzed faintly, throwing a pale cone of light onto the wet pavement. I stepped off the last plank and onto solid ground, the sudden firmness of asphalt shocking under my feet. For a heartbeat, the sound behind me stopped completely. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Something told me the bridge was still occupied, that if I turned, I would see a shape halfway across, too tall, too broad, standing perfectly still in the mist. The thought of it waiting there, silent and patient, rooted me in place. I forced myself to keep walking, my shoes striking the road in a quick, nervous rhythm. The night air felt no safer on this side. It clung to my clothes, carrying the faint echo of those boots long after I had left the bridge behind. Every few steps, I swore I heard them again. A distant thud carried across the water, too soft to be certain, too steady to be imagined. I didn't stop until I reached the next intersection, where the yellow glow of a gas station spilled across the street like a promise of warmth. Only then did I dare to glance back. The bridge was nothing more than a dark shape swallowed by fog. No figure stood upon it. No sound followed me. But as I turned to continue home, a faint creak drifted through the night. It came from the direction of the river, a single groan of wood under a weight too heavy to belong to the wind. The sound was slow, deliberate, as if something had just taken one more step onto the bridge. And I knew, without seeing, that it was waiting for someone else to cross. The air on that particular night felt heavier than usual, a damp weight pressing down from the low clouds that smothered the sky. The street where I lived was never loud, but that evening the quiet seemed to stretch and fold in on itself, becoming something more oppressive than peaceful. Street lights dotted the length of the cul-de-sac like tired sentinels, each halo of light struggling to hold back the dark that pooled between them. The pavement was slick from an earlier drizzle, reflecting those pale circles in broken shards of gold and silver. I left my friend's house later than planned, clutching my jacket tighter as I stepped off their porch. The temperature had dropped sharply while we talked, and the cold nipped at my ears and the tips of my fingers. My car waited a few blocks away, parked on the only stretch of curb that wasn't clogged with evening guests. I remember thinking the walk would be quick, barely 5 minutes of empty sidewalk before I was behind the wheel and headed home. But the moment the door shut behind me and I started down that narrow street, I felt the first ripple of unease slide across my skin. The neighborhood was familiar. I'd driven through it countless times, past these houses without giving them a second thought. Yet on foot, under the weak spill of the street lamps, it all looked different. The manicured lawns were dark seas of damp grass. Driveways stretched like black tongues into deeper shadow. Curtains in the windows caught the faintest glow of televisions or night lights, but no movement stirred behind them. It was a street asleep, and I was the only thing awake enough to notice. My footsteps sounded too loud. Each contact of rubber on wet concrete echoed slightly, bouncing back from the neat rows of houses. I tried to keep a steady rhythm, but the sound betrayed me, hollow and sharp in the open silence. A car several streets over started its engine, a distant cough that rose and faded before settling back into nothing. I adjusted my pace, quickening just a little, not enough to look hurried, at least not to anyone who might have been watching. That's when I first heard it. It was subtle, barely a whisper against the slick pavement. A second set of steps, far behind me but distinct enough to slice through the quiet. They weren't synchronized with my own. They fell in between my strides, a soft patter that seemed to pause when I paused, to stretch and shorten as I tried to convince myself it was coincidence. I slowed. The sound slowed. I stopped completely. Silence. My breath formed pale clouds in the cold air. I turned my head, eyes scanning the long corridor of streetlights and shadows. Nothing moved. No silhouettes, no swaying branches, not even a stray cat darting across a yard. Just the empty sidewalk slick with reflections. I told myself it was the houses. Maybe water dripping from a gutter, maybe the shifting of a wooden porch cooling in the night. The logic barely held. I started walking again, forcing my pace to remain measured. The sound returned. Not louder, closer. The pattern was unmistakable now. A step, a pause. Another step. The faint scrape of a shoe sole catching the edge of a rough patch of concrete. Each sound landed in the space between my own movements, like an echo that refused to match the original. The hair on the back of my neck lifted in a slow, deliberate wave. I didn't look back this time. Something in me feared that turning would confirm a shape, a figure pacing behind me, something I wasn't ready to see. Instead, I focused on the next pool of light, the next safe circle where the glow hit the pavement. My eyes darted to each yard as I passed, cataloging details to tether myself to reality. A mailbox leaning slightly forward, a ceramic owl perched on a porch railing, a trash can tipped just enough to rock in the breeze. Ordinary things, yet they felt staged, as if someone had arranged them to distract me from the sound drawing closer. The smell of wet earth rose from the flower beds. The asphalt carried the sharp, metallic tang of recent rain. I tasted it in the back of my throat, a cold mineral bite that made swallowing feel like forcing down gravel. My jacket creaked when I moved, every fabric sound amplified to the point of distortion. Even my own breathing seemed too present, too deliberate, as if the night were holding a microphone to every part of me. Another step, closer still. The rhythm changed as the unseen follower entered the next stretch of sidewalk. I could hear the difference in texture, the faint crunch of grit underfoot, the squeak of water in a shallow dip. I knew this street well enough to picture the patch of uneven pavement they had reached. The thought of someone matching my route so precisely sent a shiver crawling along my spine. I quickened my pace again, no longer caring about appearances. The distance to my car couldn't be more than 2 more streetlights. I tried to calculate it in seconds, but the math dissolved in the fog of adrenaline. Each footfall behind me answered my own with a relentless steadiness. The gap between us shrank with a kind of careful patience, like whoever, or whatever, was following wasn't rushing, just closing in because it could. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, shaking loose a scatter of wet leaves that skittered across the sidewalk. For a brief moment the sound masked everything, a rush of organic noise that almost convinced me I'd imagined it all. But as the wind died, the steps remained clearer than before. They were inside the sound now, weaving through it, making the leaves seem like a curtain drawn back to reveal the truth. I reached the final turn before the small side street where my car waited. The lamppost at the corner flickered once, then again, each pulse of dimness swallowing the world into black for a fraction of a second. My shadow jumped and stretched with each flicker, elongating across the wet pavement until it seemed to merge with the darkness behind me. In one of those brief flashes, I thought I saw something at the far end of the street, a shape slightly darker than the night, paused in mid-step. The light steadied. The shape was gone. My chest tightened. I forced myself to breathe, to keep moving. The air tasted different now, a sour tang of ozone and damp metal that clung to the back of my tongue. My ears throbbed with the sound of my own pulse, but underneath it the steps continued. Closer. Too close. I crossed into the final stretch, the small side street that bent slightly out of view. My car waited halfway down, a dim silhouette beneath a drooping tree branch. I could see the faint gleam of water on the roof, the reflection of a distant porch light trembling across the windshield. Safety was a few yards away, but those yards stretched like an endless corridor. The steps quickened. Not a sprint, just enough to close the last sliver of distance. The sound of wet shoes striking pavement grew sharp, deliberate, almost eager. Panic surged through me like electricity. My hand fumbled in my pocket for the keys, metal scraping against fabric with a clumsy desperation. I didn't dare look back. The instinct to do so burned in every muscle, but some deeper survival impulse warned me that turning would mean meeting eyes in the dark. Instead, I fixed my gaze on the car, on the shimmer of moisture across the driver's side door, and forced my legs to move faster than they ever had. The sound behind me broke its careful rhythm. Steps overlapped, stuttered, then rushed. The wet slap of shoes against concrete grew jagged, urgent. I could feel the air shift as if something sliced through it, a pressure change brushing the back of my neck. My keys slipped once, nearly tumbling to the ground before I caught them and jammed the largest into the lock. The moment the door latch clicked open, the night seemed to snap. The rush of footsteps stopped mid-stride, cut cleanly as though someone had severed the sound with a knife. I yanked the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut with enough force to shake the window. The car rocked slightly, the suspension groaning under the sudden weight. For several seconds, I sat frozen, hands trembling on the steering wheel, eyes locked on the narrow slice of sidewalk visible through the windshield. The street lay empty. No figure, no movement, only the slow drip of water from the tree branch above and the faint hiss of wind through the leaves. I engaged the lock with a sharp click that echoed in the cabin. My breath fogged the inside of the glass as I struggled to slow the frantic pounding of my heart. Still, I searched the shadows, convinced that if I blinked, I'd catch a glimpse of something just outside the halo of the next streetlight. A face, a shape, the source of those deliberate steps. Nothing appeared. The engine started on the second turn of the key, a comforting growl that filled the silence. I backed out slowly, eyes darting from mirror to mirror, watching every yard, every patch of darkness as the car crept forward. Each time my tires rolled over a wet patch of pavement, the sound of rubber on asphalt mimicked those trailing footsteps, and I flinched despite myself. Only when I reached the main road did the tightness in my chest ease enough to breathe fully. The suburban street receded behind me, swallowed by distance and darkness. Yet even as the city lights began to bloom ahead, I couldn't shake the sensation of presence, the certainty that something had been there with me, moving deliberately through the silence, savoring every step it took to close the distance. To this day, when I park on quiet streets after dark, I still hear it, that soft, patient rhythm rising in the spaces between my own steps. Waiting, matching, closing in. The station had been closed for years, but the night I stepped through its rusted gates, it felt as though it had only just been abandoned. The air held a faint scent of iron and damp wood, the way old places sometimes trap the ghosts of rain. A heavy moon hung low above the cracked glass roof, its pale glow pooling across the platform like stagnant water. Every surface seemed slick with a thin film of cold, the kind that clings to skin and makes each breath feel too loud. I had no reason to be there other than curiosity. The town whispered about the old station, about the way its clocks still ticked even though the power had long been cut. They said trains could sometimes be heard in the dead hours, metal wheels screaming against rails that no longer led anywhere. I wanted to see if any of it was true. I wanted to feel the weight of a place where time itself had been left behind. The main hall greeted me with a slow exhale of dust. My flashlight beam skated across peeling timetables, their paper edges curled like burned leaves. A single bench stood crooked in the center, its wooden slats scarred with initials and the sharp grooves of knives long gone dull. The smell here was deeper, wet concrete, the faint bitterness of mold hiding in unseen corners. My own footsteps echoed in the cavernous room, a hollow, deliberate sound that seemed to come back to me a half-second late. Each step felt intrusive, like pressing fingers into a wound. Somewhere above, a droplet of water fell from the cracked ceiling and hit the marble floor. The sharp tap cut through the silence with surgical precision. I followed the sound down the corridor leading to the platforms. The walls narrowed slightly, lined with old ticket windows sealed with iron grates. Behind the glass, darkness sat like a sleeping animal. I could almost imagine faces pressed there, waiting for trains that would never arrive. My light trembled against the tiled floor, revealing a thin trail of debris, splinters of wood, a single rusted bolt, a flattened paper cup that must have been decades old. As I stepped onto the platform itself, the air changed. It was colder here, dense with a metallic tang that made the inside of my mouth taste faintly of pennies. The track stretched out into a tunnel at the far end, a yawning mouth of blackness. My own reflection wavered in the remaining shards of safety glass along the edge of the platform, a pale figure floating in a broken mirror. Then I heard it, a second pair of footsteps. They were faint at first, soft enough that I almost mistook them for the shifting of old wood or the distant echo of my own movements. But as I stood perfectly still, holding my breath until my chest ached, the sound continued. Slow, deliberate steps, measured and heavy, as though someone was carefully matching the rhythm of my heartbeat. They came from somewhere down the platform, beyond the range of my flashlight. The beam of light trembled in my hand as I swept it across the tracks, the walls, the empty benches. Nothing moved. Dust hung motionless in the cold air, each particle spinning like a tiny planet. Yet the sound persisted, a patient cadence, the soft drag of a soul against aged concrete. It was not the echo of my own steps. It was too independent. There was a small, almost imperceptible pause after each one, like the careful hesitation of someone testing their weight on old bones. I forced myself to move forward. The air thickened with every step, each breath tasting of iron filings and wet stone. My ears strained against the silence between the noises, searching for the pattern, the origin. The tunnel at the far end of the platform gaped wider as I approached, swallowing the weak light of my flashlight. A faint draft slipped out from its throat, carrying with it the sour smell of stagnant water and rust. The footsteps grew clearer, not ahead, beside me. They ran parallel to my own, just far enough away that I could not pinpoint their source. My skin tightened as if tiny hooks were dragging across it. I swung the beam toward the tracks, the benches, the shadowed columns holding up the roof. Nothing, only the endless repetition of my own shallow breathing and that second, impossible rhythm. Something about the sound unsettled me more than any visible threat could have. It had weight. It had intent. Each step was careful, almost respectful, as though whoever, or whatever, was sharing the platform knew exactly how much pressure to apply to keep the ancient floor from groaning. It felt intelligent in its patience, like a predator that had already closed the distance but chose to walk instead of run. I moved toward the tunnel, driven by a strange compulsion to see what waited inside. The darkness ahead seemed thicker than natural night, as though the air itself refused to carry light. My flashlight beam dissolved only a few feet in, revealing slick walls weeping with condensation. The floor dipped slightly, and the smell intensified, rust, wet stone, something faintly organic, like rotting leaves or old meat buried under damp soil. Behind me, the footsteps quickened, not by much, just enough to betray eagerness. A faint scrape of rubber against concrete, a soft shift of weight. I froze. The silence that followed was suffocating. The draft from the tunnel stilled as if the air itself was holding its breath. I could hear the faint, high-pitched ringing of my own pulse in my ears. My grip on the flashlight tightened until the plastic casing creaked. Then came a single step. Close. Too close. The sound of a shoe meeting the platform, just behind my left heel. I spun around, the flashlight's beam carving through the dark. Empty platform. Empty hall beyond. My own long shadow stretched across the cracked tiles, quivering slightly with the tremor of my hand. There was nothing there. Nothing but the deep, aching cold. The station felt larger now, as though the walls had pulled back while I wasn't looking. The silence no longer seemed passive. It pressed against me, thick and expectant. I became acutely aware of the texture of the floor beneath my shoes, the slick grit of old dust, the faint give of warped wood under concrete slabs. Every detail sharpened to a painful clarity, as though the world itself wanted me to notice that I was not alone. Another step, this time from the tunnel. It echoed strangely, a hollow resonance that carried more weight than the narrow passage should allow. The sound was slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud against the muffled quiet. It carried a texture I cannot forget, a wet heaviness like fabric soaked in dark water. Each successive step emerged from the blackness, but no figure followed. Only sound, only presence. I retreated, keeping the beam fixed on the tunnel mouth. The air thickened with each backward step, as though the station itself was reluctant to let me go. The walls seemed to hum with a low vibration, too deep to hear but strong enough to feel in my ribs. My breath came fast, each exhale forming a pale ghost in the cold air. When I finally reached the main hall, the second footstep stopped. Not faded. Stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it felt unnatural. No dripping water, no distant groan of shifting metal, not even the faint hum of night insects beyond the broken windows. The station held its breath as I crossed the threshold, and for one fleeting second, I sensed something just behind the doorframe. Close enough to touch, patient enough to wait. I did not run until I reached the street. The cold night air outside felt sharp and almost electric, carrying the faint smell of rain and distant asphalt. I kept walking, faster and faster, until the ruined station disappeared behind a wall of trees and shadows. But even now, long after that night, I sometimes hear it when the world grows quiet. A second pair of footsteps, perfectly matched to my own, keeping pace just beyond the edge of sight. The street was never supposed to feel that empty. It was one of those late evenings when the air folds itself into layers of silence, the kind that makes you notice the sound of your own breathing. The city had thinned out hours ago. Cars were sparse, lights dimmed to their regulated glow, and the air carried the faint metallic tang of distant rain that hadn't yet arrived. I had taken this route countless times, down the narrow sidewalk that cut between rows of unremarkable houses, past the small, weedy playground, and out toward the main road where the bus stop waited like a quiet promise of safety. The night felt still at first, but not in the peaceful way. It was the kind of stillness that seems to press against your ears, where each step you take feels almost intrusive. My shoes scraped against the concrete, releasing small, deliberate sounds into the heavy air. A single street lamp ahead flickered once, throwing a faint pulse of yellow across the wet pavement. Somewhere far behind, a dog barked, short, sharp, and quickly silenced. I pulled my jacket tighter and kept moving, feeling the thin breeze slide through the gaps between the houses like cold fingers. That was when I heard it, a quick, distinct rhythm, the sharp slap of rubber soles striking pavement in a hurried pattern. Running. Behind me, the sound appeared suddenly, as if it had been waiting just outside the edge of my awareness, timed perfectly to match the beat of my own steps. At first it was distant, an echo maybe, a trick of the street's narrow acoustics. But no. The cadence was too deliberate, too clean. Each impact carried the unmistakable weight of a human stride. I slowed slightly. The running slowed too. It wasn't just that the sound grew quieter. It stopped. Exactly when I did. My breath stalled in my chest, a thin, burning pause that made the air feel heavier than before. I turned my head, slow enough to hear the creak of my own neck muscles. The street stretched behind me like a dark, hollow corridor. Houses sat in their silent rows, windows blackened or glowing faintly behind curtains. Nothing moved. I forced myself forward, each step deliberate. The instant my shoes met the concrete again, the sound returned. Running. Closer this time. Quick, hurried, like someone trying to close a gap. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. The air felt wrong, dense, damp, almost electric. I could taste the faint metallic sharpness of ozone on my tongue, though the sky above was a blank, starless black. My ears strained against the silence, searching for anything. A car, a voice, the rustle of a tree. Nothing answered, only the faint, lingering memory of running feet. I tested the space again with a single, cautious step. Behind me, the running resumed, perfectly timed, perfectly measured. Not walking, running. Every time I moved, it followed. Every time I stopped, it fell silent, leaving me stranded in a pocket of still air, heart hammering so hard I could feel the pulse in my fingertips. I tried to convince myself it was an echo. The street was narrow, the houses tall, sound could behave strangely here. But echoes don't carry weight. They don't breathe intent into the night. These footsteps had mass. They had purpose. And they were close enough now that I could almost feel the vibrations tremble faintly through the pavement beneath my shoes. The sidewalk bent slightly ahead, leading into a longer stretch of road with fewer houses. No cover. No hidden corners. Just an open run toward the bus stop half a mile away. I knew if I turned off now into one of the side alleys, I'd only trap myself in a dead end. So I chose the only option that made sense. Keep moving. Faster this time. My feet struck the concrete in a quicker rhythm, the sound of my own steps loud enough to drown the shallow rasp of my breathing. And with each increase in pace, the footsteps behind me surged to match. They weren't cautious anymore. They were urgent, aggressive, the pounding of someone sprinting with intent. I risked a glance over my shoulder. Nothing. The street behind me lay empty under the sickly orange wash of the lamps. No shadowed figure. No flash of movement. Just an open stretch of dark pavement that seemed to swallow light whole. But the sound was still there, closer than ever. I didn't need to see to know. The air turned colder the farther I ran. My lungs burned with each sharp inhale, the night air carrying a damp chill that clung to the inside of my throat. The faint smell of wet asphalt rose from the street, mixing with something else, a sour, almost sweet odor, faint but distinct, like decaying leaves or something left too long in the dark. I tried stopping again, desperate to catch a clear sound. My body halted mid-stride, shoes skidding slightly on the slick surface. Silence slammed into me like a wall. The footsteps died the instant mine did. I stood frozen, the cold wind crawling through my jacket, my ears ringing with the absence of sound. Seconds stretched. A minute, maybe more. The street didn't move. No running. No breathing that wasn't mine. Just the distant hum of the city's sleeping machinery, muffled and far away. I stepped forward. The running burst to life behind me, louder than before, each strike of foot against pavement sharp enough to rattle inside my skull. Whoever, or whatever, followed was no longer trying to hide. The houses thinned as I reached the long open stretch. No more fences to duck behind, no parked cars to shield me. Just the raw, exposed length of road lit by intermittent lamps that buzzed faintly in the damp night air. My shadow stretched long and thin before me, trembling slightly with each flicker of the lights. I ran. Not a jog, not a careful pace, full sprint, heart pounding so violently I thought my ribs might crack. The sound behind me matched beat for beat, a relentless pursuit that refused to fade no matter how fast I pushed myself. Each slam of footstep echoed off the pavement, sharp and clean, like the night itself was amplifying it. Halfway down the stretch, one of the street lamps overhead flickered violently and went dark. The road ahead plunged into a smear of shadow. I didn't slow. I couldn't. My shoes scraped through small puddles, splashing cold water up the sides of my legs. The sour-sweet smell intensified, filling my nose with something rotten, something alive. Then, abruptly, the sound stopped. Not faded. Stopped. I skidded to a halt, shoes grinding against the wet asphalt. My breath tore out of me in ragged gasps, clouding in the cold. The silence that followed was worse than the pursuit. It wasn't relief. It was expectation, the kind of quiet that waits for you to make the next move. The bus stop stood ahead, a faint glass structure glowing weakly beneath the last working lamp. Safety was so close I could almost feel its artificial warmth. Yet my feet refused to move. The air felt thick, as though the darkness itself pressed against me. Every instinct screamed that if I took another step, I would hear it again. I forced myself forward. One step. No sound. Another. Still nothing. The absence of the running was somehow worse than the chase. Each quiet second felt stretched thin, as though something unseen paced just outside my reach, ready to match me the instant I forgot it was there. The faint sour odor lingered, following me like a ghost, curling through the damp air long after the footsteps had gone. I reached the bus stop and stood inside the fragile glass shelter. The fluorescent bulb above hummed a weak, uneven tune, flickering every few seconds. My reflection in the scratched glass looked pale, eyes wide and unfocused. Behind me, the street lay empty, slick with the sheen of distant rain. No one came. No running. No sound at all. I waited until the first bus finally arrived, its headlights slicing through the darkness like a lifeline. I boarded without looking back, though every fiber of my body begged me to glance at the road one last time. I kept my eyes forward, staring at the dull interior lights, pretending I couldn't feel the faint vibration beneath the floor. A low rhythmic pulse, soft but steady. Like footsteps keeping time with the wheels.